Hello friends and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm really glad you're here. If you're new here, my name is Becca. This channel is all about my love for spinning, knitting, crocheting, sewing, weaving, all the fiber things. I invite you to grab whatever project you have on the go and join me. Let's make some stuff. Today I wanted to share with you some spinning related accessories or tools that I have found that really improved my spinning. But first I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm wearing. This is my very first hand spun sweater. It's a top down yoked percentage sweater. The dark brown is Jacob wool. The gray is Gotland. And then there's a band of burgundy and a band of turquoise that set off the yoke. This, and I also have cuffs that have the Gotland and the striping as well. This was also my first attempt with individual breeds of sheep. And so I really like how they offset against one another. It's a little bit scratchy. The Jacob is a little bit scratchy. The Gotland is a long wool. And so it's got this halo that contrasts, I think, really nicely with the dark of the Jacob. This was my first hand-spun sweater that I've made. Winter is almost over, just a few more days, and happy spring to everyone. But I wanted to share my progress on my winter project. I did not complete the entire thing. However, I did finish the knitting. So if you haven't seen my previous videos, this is the project that I'm making for winter. This is the Orange Albertine Jacket from a Norwegian knitwear designer, Sidsel Hoivik. It is an amazing, amazing pattern, stranded Norwegian style knitting. It's a cardigan, so it will be steeked up the front, steeks for the sleeves, and then tons of embellishment. So there's a bunch of duplicate stitch, there are sequins, there are beads, there's crocheted edging, so lots still to work on, but I'm happy to report that I did finish the knitting. So here is the body. I'll be cutting open the steeks for the sleeves. The duplicate stitch is going to be on the center back and then around the edging. And then just this last week, I've finished the sleeves. Here are the two sleeves. They are identical. They have a facing, so all of the steeked edges will have a facing that covers up the raw stitches. And it doesn't look like much yet, but the cuffs have pink as the background instead of the cream color. But all of this is going to have duplicate stitch embroidery around it, and it's really going to set it off beautifully. Again, we've got facings for the cuffs. There's going to be a crocheted edging all around the sides. So lots of work still to do, but I did complete the knitting in winter. So hooray! And one other update on my works in progress. I have completed the spinning for my planned spin to weave project. So you can see behind me all of my yarn that I've spun up. This has not been, the twist hasn't been set yet, so it will probably bloom a little bit more than it is, but this was the first time I tried spinning tweeds, and so the fiber that I had selected already had the neps in it. It's a 2-ply that I spun on my antique Ukrainian spinning wheel, and it is just this lovely sort of mossy green. The neps are everything from sort of an olive brownish green to a pine green, or a emerald green in there as well. So lots of wonderful texture. My plan is to weave this into cloth and hopefully sew myself a garment from it. So step 1 finished. The spin is now done. So now I want to talk about spinning related accessories or spinning tools that aren't spinning wheels or spindles. One of the things that I love most about spinning is how easy it is to get into it. You don't need a lot of tools. None of these things that I'm going to share with you today are essential tools for spinning. Really all you need is some fiber and a spindle and you can get started spinning. But over the years, I've discovered some of these tools and I found that they really took my spinning from rustic hobby, do-it-yourself kind of a feeling to something that really felt more professional and made me feel like a spinner with a capital S, I suppose. And so those are the things that I want to share with you today. The first tool that I want to share with you is something called a Niddy Noddy. I have two Niddy Noddies. One is from Kromski and the other is from Ashford. And these Niddy Noddies are both made of wood. I've seen them in PVC. It doesn't really matter what the material is, but essentially a Niddy Noddy is a long shaft with two cross pieces at the end, and you rotate the cross pieces so that they are perpendicular to one another, and you wind your yarn around it to make a continuous loop to make a skein. I'm going to be pulling the yarn off of my Lazy Kate, which I've shared before. A Lazy Kate is essentially just a plank of wood with some dowels in it that you can put your bobbins on, which is really handy for plying. I'm going to be using this one today for making my skein. So here's my completed full bobbin of yarn. This has been plied, so I'm going to put it on the floor. So the way a Niddy Noddy works is that you wind around the arms to make a continuous loop of yarn. These come in different sizes. The Ashford that I have is the 1.5 meter one. The Kromski is a little bit larger, 72 inches, I believe, roughly 2 meters. So the size of the Niddy Noddy determines the size of the loop, determines the size of the skein. And so they also come in smaller ones. I've seen little tiny ones that are about half this size that they use to make sample skeins. So if you've seen those out and about, the little tiny skeins, they probably made them with one of these. So now I'm going to show you how to use the Niddy Noddy. So the Niddy Noddy has these two cross pieces, and on one side of the cross piece there's a little hook, and the other side is smooth so that you can pull your loop off of the Niddy Noddy once you're finished, and the hook is there to keep it from sliding off as you're winding. So I usually hold the beginning of the yarn with my thumb in the center, and I will wrap around the top, around the bottom, around the top, and around the bottom, and then I'm back to the beginning. And so you can hear the bobbin spinning along the Lazy Kate at the bottom there. But you just rock the Niddy Noddy back and forth, and it winds this continuous loop of yarn. So it's a very relaxing motion. I usually just do this straight off the spinning wheel, so I loosen the tension up on my wheel so that the bobbin will spin freely, and then I'll just pull off the skein straight from the bobbin. I really love managing my yarn this way. It makes really beautiful skeins of yarn, which I think just look fantastic, and they're nice and squishy. These are some that I've spun previously. These are both hand spun yarns. But essentially, a skein is just a big loop of yarn. Get it untangled here. A big loop of yarn. It's tied in a couple of places to keep it all managed, but the yarn is nice and relaxed. And then to make a skein, you just twist, 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 just like you're plying yarn until it starts twisting back on itself. And then I maintain those two loops that I've made. I sort of even out the tension by pulling on it, untwisting it, and then let it twist back. And then you take one of those loops and feed the other one through it, and you have a skein of yarn. So I'll finish up winding this and then show you how I take it off of the Niddy Noddy. Notice that I am moving the Niddy Noddy sort of rocking it back and forth rather than winding the yarn around it. Okay, so here we are at the end. I'm going to remove it from my leader, and then I have two ends to my yarn. I've got the one that I just pulled off and the one that I started with. And you can use waste yarn to tie this off. I usually just use the ends, and so I will take the end, kind of wrap it around and tuck the end through, so just a single knot, and then I tuck the end into the skein. And then I'll do the same thing with the other end. So around it goes. This is a little bit awkward to do, and so that you can see. So I've tucked the end through into a single knot. I'm going to tug it tight and then just sort of tuck the end in. Now I have the two sides. One side is smooth, the other is hooked, and so I'm going to pull the skein off of the smooth side, and now it is off of my Niddy Noddy in a continuous loop. And just like before, I'm going to twist. I twist one side forward and the other side back in this motion until it's a little bit tight and it has tension on itself. There's different ways to adjust the center point. Often I'll just tuck it under my chin so I get the center. And then again, it's a little bit wonky, so I untwist it, give it a tug so that it evens out the twist, and then there you have it, a finished skein of yarn. I also have another tool for making skeins of yarn. This is called a clock reel, also sometimes called a weasel. If you've heard the nursery rhyme Pop Goes the Weasel, it's referring to this tool, so I've heard. The clock reel this actually is one of my oldest antique items related to fiber arts and spinning. I found it in a local antique shop and they had no idea what it was. I was really excited to get it. But it's called a clock reel because there is a mechanism inside where every time you turn the crank and rotate the reel around, it engages a mechanism and counts how many rotations you've done. This one unfortunately no longer works. It is a very old item. So probably close to 200 years old, at least 150 years old. It's a very old tool, and so the fact that this one doesn't work doesn't bother me in the slightest. It is still functional, and it just rotates around on a central wooden shaft very smoothly. You can find antiques that do have the clock mechanism still functioning. This is longer than my Niddy Noddy. So this is the length of yarn or the length of the skein from my Niddy Noddy. This is the longer Niddy Noddy, the 2-meter one. The clock reel is about 3 meters, and it, as you can see, this is a smaller skein of yarn, so less yarn, but the length is much different. So if I unwind this skein, this little mini skein here, you can see this is a much longer skein than the one off of the Niddy Noddy. Those are my tools for making skeins of yarn, the Niddy Noddies and the clock reel or the weasel. The next tools that I want to tell you about are for making balls of yarn or cakes of yarn from your skeins. Now this is great for hand spun yarn because you have to get it into a ball of yarn or a cake of yarn so that you can use it for knitting or crocheting in some way. You can of course wind a ball of yarn by hand. And I've done this plenty of times. So to wind a center pull ball, I usually start with the end loose, and then to keep it from getting too tight, I wind with a couple of my fingers in. I remove that and keep the ball, the center, around my thumb. Then I wind around my fingers again for a couple of times, rotate, and then keep going on like that. Keep rotating. This keeps it loose so that your ball doesn't get too tight. You don't want your ball to be so tight that it's putting a lot of tension on the yarn. And then once you have your ball, you just slide it off of your thumb, and your initial end, assuming you've kept it out, is there ready to pull from the center of the ball. That's great. Makes nice balls of yarn. It's a bit meditative to do, to just wind into balls. But it is important to manage your yarn in some way if you've taken it from a skein to something that you're going to be able to use to knit with. You could loosen your skein, drape it over the back of a chair, and knit from it that way, but the likelihood that it's going to become a tangled mess is really high, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it. So managing your yarn in some way so that it is easy to use, not going to get all tangled up. I do often, when I get to the ends of my center pull ball and it starts to become loose and start to tangle, I will wind it with as a center pull ball by hand, just to manage that last little bit. So the tools, though, that I have for making balls of yarn are ball winders. The first ball winder, actually this is the second one that I've had, is a plastic one from Knit Picks. So this ball winder has an angled shaft. This is where you wind the yarn around. It has an arm with a little pigtail that you thread the yarn through. So you wind the yarn through, you hook it through this little groove in the top. This is going to be the center pull ball. Kind of give it a couple of wraps to hold it in place. And then there's a crank on the side. It tells you always turn it in one direction. And as you turn, it rotates that angled shaft around. And that is what makes a beautiful cake of yarn. This one has a way to clamp it to the table, which is the way that I always use it. It also came with a handle that you could hold it by hand. I guess you'd hold it in one hand and crank it with the other. That feels a little bit awkward to me, and so I always just clamp it to the table. I said this is the second one that I've gotten. They're fairly inexpensive, about $30, but the mechanism inside, the gears that make it rotate, are plastic, which doesn't hold up over forever, and so at some point it did break and I had to buy another one. So I've had this for years. I use it all the time. I think it is fantastic, and it's really taken my made me feel really excited about spinning because it feels very professional to have balls of yarn that all look very tidy. In fact, when I first got it, I wound up a whole bunch of my hand spun yarn, and then I found out that that's not the best way to store your yarn, especially if it's wool, because it does put undue tension on your yarn, and that you should really store it in skeins, which is what I now do. Then I discovered these beautiful wooden ball winders, which are very similar, same concept. There's an angled shaft, a rotating crank, a pigtail to hold the yarn as it comes on in a perfect angle so that it will rotate around and make a nice ball of yarn. I'm going to show you this because I want you to learn from my mistakes. These are a little bit expensive, much more expensive than the plastic one, and so I went looking around and found a less expensive one than the ones that I could buy from the yarn shop on Amazon. And that's what this one is. It came, it's beautiful, the wood is gorgeous, and at first it worked great. But I've only had it for a few months now, and apparently the wood was not properly seasoned because it has warped. The round bottom of the shaft has warped along the direction of the grain, and it is no longer round, and therefore it no longer engages properly, and so it won't make nice balls of yarn. It makes very wonky, lopsided balls of yarn, if it makes them at all. I put a link in the description for a nice version of one of these, probably the one that I will be replacing this one with, but this is not a place to save a few dollars. I would recommend going, if you're going to buy one of these, go for the economy Knit Picks version. It's great, works great for years, makes fantastic balls of yarn, or go with the ones from a reputable company that you know, rather than a budget version. But it is still beautiful. And I have one more tool to share with you, and that is very useful for making, turning skeins into balls. So your skein of yarn is a big loop, and you want to be able to manage this as you're winding it into a ball so that it doesn't get tangled up. You can have a friend hold it, as long as this is a good friend who's not going to be too annoyed that you're going to be occupying them holding the yarn for a long period of time as you wind it into a ball. Or you can get something called a Swift. This is my fantastic Glimakra Swift from Sweden. It is an expandable, this is something called an umbrella Swift. It is expands and contracts very much like an umbrella. The yarn in your skein will then slip over the top of it. It has an adjustable mechanism so that you can slide it up or down, making that umbrella mechanism wider or narrower depending on the length of your skein. And then it spins freely, rotates around this central shaft as you are winding it onto a ball. So this was the final purchase that I made in terms of getting all of the spinning accessories that I currently have. I did make one, a sort of a do-it-yourself version out of wooden Tinker Toys. Yes, the Tinker Toys that have been around for decades, that are rods and dowels that you can then put together in whatever configuration. I found plans for how to make a Tinker Toy Swift, and I used it for years, and it worked all right. It was wobbly and sort of fell apart. But it did spin around, and very similar to this, you could adjust to some degree based on the size of your skeins. This was a major upgrade for me, and they're not inexpensive. However, this is another area where I would definitely not opt for a budget option, because although there's not a lot of mechanism involved in the way it functions, you want the spin to be, the rotation to be very smooth, not get hung up on things. You don't want it to catch your fiber if it's rough wood or anything like that. You don't want it to have uneven tension or rotate in a wobbly way, and you don't want it to fall apart. So this is the Glimakra. I'll put links to all of these things. This is not sponsored, but these are the tools that I found that I love that really work for me. So I'm happy to share them with you. That's it for this video. So there you have it, my favorite spinning accessories that made me feel like a spinner with a capital S. None of these items actually improved my spinning. However, they did make me want to spin more, and that did. Are there any accessories that I didn't talk about that you love? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for spending some of your creative time with me. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!